Complacent. It's a word you might think of when looking at the design decisions for gamepads over the last few generations. As we approach the release of the PS5 and revised Xbox, the form factors couldn't be any closer between the three industry leaders. Early in the history of home console gaming, each manufacturer made wild design choices, trying to stand apart from the competition. Nevertheless, as years pressed on, certain design choices clearly stood out, influencing future innovation. With the release of the original Xbox's Duke controller, each following generation that has passed appears to start with Microsoft's tried and true design, tweaking the ergonomics slightly so to be familiar yet different enough not to be an outright copycat. On occasion though, it's hard to tell where inspiration stops. Sometimes, the placements of the analog control sticks and buttons may be swapped, D-pad designs may be different, buttons are often different shapes and sizes, triggers may be analog or digital, the list goes on and on. The Xbox controller has dominated the space, directly influencing most of the major controllers offered over the last decade. As has been preached for some time, the inspiration for what has become the standard is clearly from Microsoft's series of Xbox controllers. But what inspired Microsoft? This is Retro Impressions, the analog controller. What is an analog input and how does it vary from a digital one? If you've ever used any D-pad, the inputs are up, down, left, right, or a combination of those resulting in diagonal positions. Pressing the D-pad to the right on a software level is a yes or no situation. It's like a light switch that returns to the opposition after letting go. Press it and the light turns on, let go, and it turns off. There is no in between. The software simply asks a question. If the button is pressed, then the associated action is executed. The Atari 2600, NES, SNES, Master System, Mega Drive, Saturn, and original PlayStation gamepads are all built using this technology. The important note here is the term gamepad. While the roots can be traced back to the Intellivision, the version that stuck was based on a design that Nintendo developed for their Game & Watch series, eventually perfecting it for the NES. It's a design that would influence the kinds of games developed over the decade following the original Nintendo's release. Nintendo's controller design was so simple and effective, you can still see its impact to this day. Anyone who positioned themselves as a real competitor to Nintendo tried to imitate what they were doing. Even Sega revised its original SG-1000 controller to mirror what Nintendo had done. Prior to the invention of the D-pad, more complex controllers were on the market, giving the user precise control over what was on screen. Let's go all the way back to the beginning and look at the first ever home console, the Magnavox Odyssey. The console's main method of control centered around two knobs built using potentiometers. This allowed the user to perform precise on-screen movements that eclipsed anything the original Nintendo would offer, even though it was designed nearly 2 decades later. To be clear, a gamepad is a type of controller. However, it's important to point out that a gamepad is not a trackball, paddle, or joystick, even if some crossover does occur. Trackballs and rotary dials are also based on analog technology, giving the user precise control over the game space. Returning to the light switch, analog is like a dimmer. There is an opposition, however, every movement of the switch results in a noticeable and measurable change. There are hundreds of possibilities as the software measures where the device is positioned, rather than asking if the switch is on or off. It's why games such as Centipede, Missile Command, and Tempest didn't translate well to home consoles with digital-only control options. It's also the reason another famous 80s game didn't translate well when coming home to one particular system, the Atari 5200. While paddle and trackball-based games gave precise control, most games used 4 or 8-way joysticks. Pac-Man used a 4-way, giving the player the ability to move up, down, left, and right. The stick self-centered, so when no change in direction was desired, the user could easily move uninterrupted until they were ready to input a change. For the most part, nearly every home gaming system's main controller was based on this technology. Sometimes it was 8-way, or in one case, 16. Atari had different plans though for the 5200. The controller contained what appeared to be a traditional joystick, but this was something special. The control stick was analog, giving a full 360-degree movement range with varying speed capability to the player. One oddity was Atari's decision not to launch the 5200 with a self-centering stick, though it's now known that plans were in place to release an updated model with this feature. For games designed around the 5200 controller such as Countermeasure, Graius, and the more recently released Last Starfighter, the controller was magic. The trade-off was games designed around digital inputs are not ideal. Without a self-centering stick, it's hard to find the neutral position in games like Pac-Man, making it hard to execute the desired movements all the time. The 5200 wasn't alone in 1982 though. The Vectrex also launched with its own analog joystick, which also self-centered. Like I said, the 5200 was special though, as it introduced dual analog support to the home market, which was used in games such as Robotron. The feature utilized a special cradle that combined the two pack-in controllers into one, making it the first home console to come with and support dual analog stick controllers. For home video game systems, this is without a doubt an industry first, and something that would later be replicated by the Mega Drive, and in digital form on the Saturn with Sega's Twin Stick. While the early dual-stick analog and digital controllers saw very limited game support, they paved the way for a feature that would become mainstream after Sony reintroduced the idea with their DualShock gamepad. Atari system never caught on, and the 5200 was often maligned over its controller, which primarily stemmed from reliability issues and misplaced expectations, which were largely the result of digital input experiences not translating well to a full analog controller. A simple switch to change between analog and digital along with a self-centering stick may have been enough to cement the 5200 as one of the greatest consoles of that era. The Vectrex and 5200 were so far ahead of their time that another console wouldn't be built around this technology, shipping from launch with an analog gamepad until Nintendo's 64, which released 14 years later in 1996. So what about more traditional controllers? While Nintendo didn't offer analog controllers with their home systems until 1996, Sega was dabbling with the idea in the late 80s. Denpa Micomsoft has become very well known in recent years for their FrameMeister, but when they were first founded in the early 80s, their main focus was porting arcade games to home consoles, handling publication, and designing sophisticated controllers for home use. They proved from the get-go to be very good at what they did and entered into an agreement with Sega to port some of their most technical games to different home systems, the most impressive of which was their work on Space Harrier and Afterburner. Denpa was allowed to port these games and developed a full twin-stick analog controller that would give the player the closest arcade experience possible. At the time, Denpa was already known for making some of the highest quality controllers on the market. A joint venture with Sharp resulted in the Denpa XE1AJ, also released as the Sharp CZ8NJ2 or the Cyberstick, which was a full analog flight panel designed with Sega's Afterburner in mind. Denpa would continue to develop Sega's arcade ports and join teams such as NEC Technologies to create Space Harrier for the PC Engine, ensuring that these games also received full analog support. When it was time to release these games on Sega's flagship system, the idea of a full analog flight panel was reconsidered, resulting in a condensed gamepad known as the XE1AP. Technically, this controller was designed for racing and flight simulation. So the left stick had full 360-degree movement with variable speed capabilities, while the right stick was dubbed a throttle, giving it two-way control with variable speed capabilities as well. Unique to this and most Denpa controllers, the right thumbstick can be rotated a full 270 degrees, giving the user access to the best setup for each game played. The controller also had an analog to digital switch, making it compatible and enjoyable for use with all games. There is a number of things that remain a mystery regarding Denpa and Sega's relationship, but it's clear the partnership was very close. As far as I'm aware, this is the only full third-party controller Sega actively advertised on their game boxes, in their first-party game advertisements, and in their first-party game manuals as a selling point for compatible Sega games. The controller was incredibly influential, considering it was the first to have shoulder buttons and twin analog sticks should you discount the 5200, something that wouldn't be seen again together on a controller for nearly another decade. Denpa would exit the game development business near the mid-90s, resulting in staff from that department starting their own company called Rutubo Games. They would go on to port both Space Harrier and Afterburner to the 32X, keeping support for the XE1AP in the process. Because the XE1AP was designed by Denpa with Sega in mind, and Denpa was tasked with porting these games to Sega and non-Sega hardware, the controller is also compatible with a number of other systems including the FM Towns, the X68000, and PC Engine by using the XHE3 adapter. With the launch of the Saturn, digital was still seen as the logical controller input method, but Sega had seen promise in analog and went to work designing a controller that would truly capture the arcade experience at home. A year and a half after the Saturn's release, Sega released their analog controller dubbed the 3D Control Pad, a couple of weeks removed from the N64's debut. The controller looked like an updated Denpa XE1AP, but refined to better accommodate digital inputs. The right thumbstick was gone, but in turn we received a digital D-pad on the left side, and the first ever full analog shoulder mount trigger buttons. The most interesting thing about the Saturn 3D controller was the detachable cable. The manual even discusses it, but no one really knew why Sega went that route. No other major home console manufacturer had controllers with detachable cables, so why did Sega? Quite simply, Sega had a number of expansion units planned, think the 32X, but for a controller. Expansions included a joystick in two variations, one top mount, the other side mount, a rumble pack which would have predated the N64 version by a year had it released. Sega refers to theirs as the Vibrations Expansion Unit. There was a photo signal detecting expansion unit. It's a mouthful, but essentially the bones for a light gun add-on. A trackball, which again had two offerings, a simple top mount and a more complex bottom mount. There was a memory expansion unit, the handle expansion unit, which was essentially a full analog steering wheel, an inclination detection expansion unit with and without rumble support, which essentially turned the 3D gamepad into a motion controller, a clock, which I can't imagine anyone wanting to purchase, and the big one, a display expansion unit, which was intended to show additional game info to the player. It's quite an ambitious list, and had the Saturn been as successful as the Mega Drive, we almost certainly would have seen these hit the market. Before we move on, there are two other controllers Sega intended to release but never put into production that I think are worth mentioning. Sega had already planned the next full controller to release after the 3D gamepad, one referred to as the third embodiment. This was another 3D gamepad minus the analog stick. In its place is a full analog capable directional pad that can be changed to digital via a switch located on the back of the controller. The expansion capabilities have been removed, and this controller would have shipped with a fixed cable. The other controller isn't well documented, but would have put two directional pads on the face of the controller with all action buttons on the back. We don't know if this was an attempt at twin analog directional pads as Sega was playing with the concept around this time, or something else. As I said, the Saturn didn't catch on, so development quickly shifted to the Dreamcast, with its controller being based on the 3D control pad. The 3D control pad was actually embodiment number 2, with the first embodiment being the same controller with a slightly different shape, so the Dreamcast could be considered embodiment number 5 of this development line. The onboard memory expansion and video monitor planned for the Saturn was combined into the VMU, and two expansion slots were included this time around, with the controller's cable now permanently affixed to the unit. It's incredibly difficult to find information about hardware design and the people involved, but of what I could track down, I think it's worth noting that the Saturn, all Saturn gamepads, the Dreamcast gamepad, and the Sega Genesis Model 3 were all directly influenced by or fully designed by Akitoshi Akawa. His name is attached to everything, yet I've never heard of him before starting on this video. I think the influence that resulted in the original Xbox controllers is clear. One of the Xbox designers, Seamus Blackley, has even stated that the Dreamcast was his favorite console and that it influenced the Xbox design. In recent years, it's even been revealed that the original intention was for a built-in VMU in place of the massive center logo. It never happened though. It's worth noting that the anniversary relaunch has a display showing the boot up video from the original console, which is a nod to the original designer's intention. So while Microsoft has influenced controllers for the last 2 decades, it was Sega and Atari who influenced Microsoft, putting in place the mechanics that would later become standard equipment. Special thanks to Steve from Wired Up Retro for taking the time to fact check the script and for providing additional video footage. Wired Up Retro is a fantastic channel which focuses on obscure video game controllers. He's also part of the Atari 5200 podcast, a show dedicated to reviewing every single game for one of my personal favorite video game systems. You honestly can't go wrong checking out both his YouTube channel and the podcast, even if you don't have a 5200. Rob of Retro Game Living Room for providing additional footage. He runs another incredible channel which focuses on obscure video games and consoles, many of which have no other coverage outside of his. We also occasionally do a podcast interviewing industry icons which are posted there. He has a great video on the Odyssey and the XE1AP, so be sure to check those out. Finally, I want to thank my friend the SSG, or Southern Sega Gentleman. The man has one of the best channels on YouTube, along with the definitive video on Sega's Twin Stick for the Saturn. That's it for now. Until next time, thank you for watching Retro Impressions.